Okay, so now we proceed to the next learning objective number 2, which is explain the decisions an organizations makes and the information needed to make them and the major business processes present in most companies. Okay, as I mentioned earlier in the first video, okay, we look at the case SNS. Okay, so using this case, so actually in this learning objective number 2, we going to look at on the information needs and business process. Okay, so in using the SNS case, okay, we can determine what information will be needed, okay, to make better decision. So you can see in the case earlier, they ask what decision do they need to make successful and profitable. So they ask all the decision that they want to make, whether what price of the product, okay, and should they extend the credit and so on. Okay, so based on those decision, okay, they need to determine what information will be needed, okay, so that they can make those decisions. So information in the organization is organized through a set of related, coordinated and structured activities and tasks, okay, that performed by whether by the person or by the computer, or it can be the task that performed by the machine that can help accomplish the specific organization goal that we describe it as the business process. Okay, business process. So business organization, then we use this business process to get things done. Okay, so by definition that I mentioned earlier, the business process set of related, coordinated, structured activities and tasks, whether they performed by the people, machines or both. Okay, so that they can achieve the organization's goal. Alright, so in the case SNS, okay, we need to understand that before we collect data and processing it into the information, decision that management and other external users will be making need to be known first. Okay, so kalau you tengok look at the case, okay, the first thing that they list down is the decisions. Okay, they list down the decisions so that from the decision, okay, they're going to design and use the AIS to capture, to collect, process the correct data as needed by the decision makers, and then they produce those informations. So the key decisions and information needed often come from this business process. If you refer to table 1.2, okay, page 32. So in this table, you can look the example of business process, okay, key decisions and information needs. So this is the SNS case, okay, that you read earlier. So they decide, they list all the business process, okay. They understand first how the SNS company functions, okay, and then before they can identify the information needs, okay, so they determine first what are the key decisions. Okay, so you can read through paper 1.2. For example, I take one example business process here. Hire and train employees. Okay, so the decisions that could be made, the experience requirements. Okay, for example, they want to have employees that have experience. Okay, and then how they're going to assess integrity and competence of the applicants, how they're going to train the employees. Okay, so for them to make those decisions, okay, so they need the information. So they list all the informations needed based on the key decisions. So for example, they need information about the job description. They list all the job description, okay, and then they need the information about the history, job history, skills of the applicants. Okay, so those are the example. So if every time we need to do the want to have to know what are the informations that we are needed, so we ask what are the decisions that we want to make. All right, and then we can relate also with this business process. Okay, so this is also took from figure 1.2, and then this is where the interaction between SNS, that our integrative cases now, SNS company, and with the external and internal parties. Alright, um, so actually internal stakeholders, okay, external stakeholders include employees, okay, management, uh, and then external stakeholders, the external parties of the company, trading partners, the customer, the vendor, okay, so they are interact with have the interaction, okay, between the company and also these parties, whether it's the internal or external parties. So based on this figure 1.2, you can see the informations are goes and out the system, accounting information system in the SNS, at the SNS. Okay, and then the informations are they can get those information they can get from those parties, and also the informations from the system also goes into the they disseminate the information to the all those parties. Okay, um, okay, and then when you go through the informations in out, you can see they have various types of information. Okay, they have financial information, they have also non-financial information, okay, whether comes from internal sources or come from the external sources. So to have effective AIS, okay, the that AIS needs to be able integrate information of different types and from different sources. Okay, and then if you look at this figure 1.2 also, you they can provide a great amount of details and insight as to the flow of information going from the internal and external parties for the business process. And then this is also, we call it as the activity give get exchange. Okay, give get exchange. So go to the next slide. Okay, so give get exchange. Okay, this is exchange. Okay, this exchange it can be grouped into 5 major business process, or we call as transaction cycles. Okay, if we can look at example from SNS, so the related transactions in SNS, okay, it can be group, and then it make it as the business process. Okay, so they group all the related transaction into the business process. Alright, so what is the transaction? So transaction is the agreement between two entities to exchange goods or services, or any other event that can be measured in economic terms by the organization. That's the definition of transaction. Alright, and then we talk about the transaction processing, because we mentioned just now they can group into 5 business process or transaction cycle or transaction processing. So transaction processing, this is where the process of capturing transaction data, processing the data, store data for later use, and produce information output. So basically the processing, transaction processing, they process data, store, okay, first they capture lah, okay, and then produce information as an output. Alright, so transaction between the business organizations and external parties fundamentally involve give get exchange that I mentioned from in the last slide just now. Okay, so business process or transaction cycle, they can be grouping in these 5 um, 5 major cycles. Okay, they have revenue cycles, expenditure cycle, production cycle, human resource payroll cycle, and financing cycle. Okay, so So actually these cycles you're going to discuss in detail later in chapter 14 until chapter 17. So this is that you're going to do method of PBL to do this all those chapters ni. Alright, so refer to the revenue cycle. So this is activities associated with the selling goods and also services in exchange for cash. Okay, for example, you sell goods or services. Okay, so the goods transferred to the customer and then you get cash. Alright, or it can be also future promise that we normally mention as the account receivable. Okay, then the second cycle is expenditure cycle. So this is cycle purchase of inventory for resale or purchase of raw material in using for the production. Okay, in exchange also for cash. Okay, then production. This is involved of activities converting the raw material into the finished goods. Okay, then financing. This is activities related to the companies to acquire capital by selling shares or borrowing money. Okay, and then the last is human resource. Okay, so human resource or payroll. This is related to the activities hiring the employees, train them, compensated, evaluated, promoted, and terminated the employees. Okay, so those are the cycle. Then you're going to go into details of it in the chapter 14 and chapter 17. Okay, and then if you can see the figure, next figure is figure 1.3. Okay, so in this figure 1.3, this is where you can see the interrelated between the AIS and the subsystem. Okay, so the cycles basically with the AIS. Alright, so this is where the shows the relationship between the cycle and the general ledger and reporting system function. So this is to where the general ledger and reporting system here used to generate information for both management and external parties. So if you look at this figure, okay, you can see the arrows in out the cycle, the subsystem. Okay, and then you can see the general ledger and reporting system. Okay, so basically this is the AIS system. So this AIS system, they collect all the data from all those cycles. Okay, you can see the data arrows. Okay, from the revenue cycle, human resource cycle, financing cycle, and expenditure, production. Okay, and then that's data into the general ledger and reporting system, and then you can see one flow that arrow out from the system that you can see here, information for both internal and external users. So basically the AIS here, the function is to they process data from all those cycles. Okay, and then they store. Okay, then they generate information. So those information will be used by the both internal and external users. Okay, and then from this figure also you can see the interrelated between the cycles. Right, so between the cycles they use the data interrelated. Okay, for example, you refer to revenue cycle. So revenue cycle, they have one flow into the revenue cycle, which is finished goods. So finished goods they get from the production. So the finished goods they sell to the customer, right? So they get cash. Okay, so the cash, okay, you can see one outflow, the arrow goes into financing cycle. You can see the word funds there. So that's cash they get from the customer. So you can see in, out, and also the interrelated between one cycle to another cycle. So this is the integration between the AIS and also the integration between subsystem. Okay, and then if you and then most of the accounting software package in the market, okay, they use this transaction cycle as the separate modules. If you have experience using the accounting software, you can notice that the modules, okay, separate modules is based on the cycles. They have sales module, human resource module, and so on. Okay, and then bear in mind, not every organizations they have to implement every module, or they have each related to the cycles. Okay, for example, SNS maybe they don't have activities related to the production. Okay, because the companies just only sell the appliance and consumer electronics. Okay, so they do not produce the goods. Okay, so maybe the module related to the production cycle, they don't have they do not have the production cycle. Alright, and then most of the company maybe they have their own unique requirements. Okay, so it depends on the company lah. Okay, which module or which cycle, okay, that they related to those activities. Okay, so after this, okay, so this is the end of learning objective number 2. Okay, so after this we're going to discuss learning objective number 3. Okay, so I end this video and then I see you on the next learning outcomes number 3.